Your soulmate secretly met someone close to you. Here's what they talked about. My beloved child. There's something you need to understand before you make any assumptions about what happened. Your soulmate recently had a private conversation with someone who knows you well, and what makes this unusual isn't simply that they met, it's why they chose that person instead of coming directly to you. They didn't walk into that conversation casually. There was something weighing heavily on their mind. Something they had been thinking about for longer than you realize. At first, they tried to keep the conversation light, almost as if they were testing the waters. But then your name came up. And according to the energy surrounding this moment, the conversation became much more serious. Your soulmate wanted answers about you. They wanted to know how you've really been feeling, what you've been saying behind closed doors, and whether your heart was still open to them. But there was one question they asked that made the person sitting across from them realize just how deeply this situation had affected them. And that question is the reason you need to stay until the end. The person close to you didn't immediately give them the answer they wanted. Instead, they paused. They knew there were things they could say, but they also knew that saying too much could change everything between you and your soulmate. Your soulmate apparently admitted something they had never been brave enough to say directly to you. They were afraid they had waited too long. They were afraid that while they were trying to figure out their own emotions, you had quietly started letting go. That fear had been growing inside them, especially because they couldn't read your silence anymore. They didn't know whether you were protecting your heart, moving forward, or simply waiting for them to make the first move. Then the conversation took an unexpected turn. The person close to you brought up something about your past, something your soulmate apparently didn't fully understand. Suddenly, pieces started connecting. Your soulmate realized that a moment they once dismissed may have hurt you far more deeply than they ever imagined. Don't skip, because this is where the conversation stopped being about curiosity and became about regret. And then came the part nobody expected. Your soulmate asked the person close to you whether you still talked about them. Not casually. Not as an old memory. They wanted to know if there was still emotion behind your name when it came up. The answer they received wasn't completely direct, but it was enough to shake them. They were told that you hadn't forgotten what happened, but you also hadn't become the person they feared you had become. You still cared, but you were no longer willing to chase clarity from someone who kept giving you confusion. Your soulmate went quiet after hearing that. For a moment, they seemed to realize that the distance between you wasn't created by a lack of feeling, it was created by hesitation, fear, and things left unsaid. But there was one final piece of information shared during that private meeting, something your soulmate wasn't prepared to hear. It concerned a decision you may have already made without telling them. And once they learned about it, their entire attitude changed, because suddenly, they understood they might not have as much time as they thought. The silence that followed was different this time. Your soulmate wasn't simply processing what they had heard. They were confronting the possibility that they had misunderstood you all along. The person close to you noticed the change immediately. Your soulmate started asking more specific questions, almost carefully, as if every answer could either give them hope or take it away. They wanted to know whether you were genuinely moving on, whether someone else had entered your life, and most importantly, whether there was still a chance for the two of you to repair what had been damaged. But then the person close to you said something that your soulmate clearly wasn't expecting. If you really want to know how they feel, you need to stop asking everyone else and ask them. That sentence landed hard. Your soulmate knew it was true. For so long, they had been watching from a distance, looking for signs, waiting for the perfect moment, and secretly hoping you would make the first move. Now they were being forced to face the possibility that waiting had become the very thing keeping you apart. But the conversation wasn't over. Before leaving, your soulmate brought up one specific memory involving you, a moment that may have seemed insignificant when it happened, but apparently stayed with them. They remembered something you said, something they didn't understand at the time. Now, after everything they had just heard, those words sounded completely different. Your soulmate began connecting your behavior with emotions they had overlooked. The times you pulled away. The moments you stopped explaining yourself. The sudden quietness after certain conversations. They had interpreted those things as disinterest, when they may have actually been signs that you were protecting yourself. And this realization seemed to create a mixture of regret and urgency. The person close to you could see it on their face. Your soulmate wasn't angry at you. They were frustrated with themselves. Because suddenly, they could see how many opportunities they had allowed to pass simply because they were afraid of being vulnerable. Stay till the end, because the next detail reveals why this secret meeting may have happened at exactly this moment. Then your soulmate asked the question that changed the entire tone of the conversation: if I reached out today, would they even listen? The person close to you didn't answer immediately. Instead, they reminded your soulmate that you weren't looking for another confusing conversation or another temporary promise. If they came back, they needed to be honest. They needed to say what they actually wanted instead of hiding behind mixed signals. That answer seemed to hit your soulmate harder than anything else. They finally understood that simply missing you wasn't enough anymore. Feeling something wasn't enough. If they wanted another chance, they would have to prove that they were ready to handle the truth they had been avoiding. And just when the conversation appeared to be ending, your soulmate received one final piece of information, something about what you had recently said or done that made them realize you might already be preparing to close this chapter. Their expression changed instantly. They thanked the person close to you, walked away, and made a decision they had been delaying for far too long, but you still don't know what that decision was. Something shifted the moment your soulmate walked away from that conversation. They didn't immediately contact you. Instead, they sat with everything they had heard, replaying certain words over and over in their mind. For the first time, they weren't wondering whether you still cared. They were wondering whether you had finally reached your limit. That distinction mattered. Because deep down, your soulmate knew there had been moments when you gave them opportunities to be honest, and they chose silence instead. Now they were beginning to understand that your silence wasn't necessarily rejection. It may have been exhaustion. They remembered the conversations that ended too quickly, the messages they never answered properly, and the moments when they could have told you exactly what they felt but convinced themselves there would always be another chance. Then something unexpected happened. They went back through an old conversation between you, searching for a sentence they had once overlooked. And when they found it, they suddenly realized you had been warning them without ever saying it directly. The discovery made your soulmate more emotional than they expected. They began asking themselves why they had been so afraid to be vulnerable with you. Was it pride? Fear of rejection? Or were they carrying something from their past that made trusting someone difficult? The person close to you had unknowingly exposed a truth your soulmate had been avoiding. They weren't confused about you. They were confused about whether they were worthy of the kind of connection they felt with you. That realization changed the way they looked at everything. They started thinking about the possibility of losing you permanently, not temporarily. And suddenly, the idea of someone else becoming important in your life felt much more real. They didn't want to control your choices, but they couldn't ignore the jealousy and fear rising inside them. So they considered doing something they had avoided for a long time. Coming directly to you without excuses, without rehearsed explanations, and without pretending everything was fine. But before they could make that move, another conversation happened, and this one revealed something even more personal. The person close to you received another message from your soulmate later that day. It wasn't long. It simply asked for one thing: honesty. Your soulmate wanted to know what you had truly said about them when they weren't around. Not gossip. Not assumptions. The truth. And the response they received forced them to confront the one possibility they had been trying hardest to avoid, that you still had feelings, but you were no longer waiting indefinitely for them to act. Your soulmate stared at that message for a long time. Then they finally made a choice. They stopped asking other people for clues and started preparing to speak to you themselves. But there was one detail they still didn't know. The person close to you had left something out of the conversation. Something important. Something they chose not to reveal because they believed your soulmate needed to discover it directly from you, and when that hidden detail finally comes out, the entire meaning of this secret meeting could change. The hidden detail was not what your soulmate expected. The person close to you had deliberately held something back because they knew it wasn't their story to tell. They knew your soulmate needed to hear it from you, not through someone else. But that unanswered piece of the conversation stayed in your soulmate's mind. It made them wonder whether you had been protecting a feeling, a decision, or perhaps a truth you were afraid would change everything between you. Instead of ignoring that uncertainty, your soulmate began looking at their own behavior differently. They realized that they had spent too much time trying to decode your actions while giving you very little certainty in return. Every unanswered question suddenly felt heavier. Every missed opportunity felt more important. And then they remembered the exact moment when they first sensed you pulling away. They had blamed circumstances. They had blamed timing. They had even convinced themselves you simply didn't feel the same way anymore. But now, after that private conversation, they were beginning to question every assumption they had made. What happened next was quieter, but far more meaningful. Your soulmate opened their phone several times, typed something to you, erased it, and started again. They weren't looking for a casual message. They wanted to say something that could finally break through the distance between you. But they were terrified of choosing the wrong words. They knew a simple, "I miss you," wouldn't explain everything. They knew an apology without action wouldn't be enough. So they began thinking about what they could actually offer you: honesty, consistency, and the courage to stop hiding behind uncertainty. Meanwhile, The person close to you remained completely unaware of how much their conversation had changed your soulmate's thinking. They had simply answered what they felt comfortable answering, but those answers had opened a door your soulmate had kept locked for months. Then came the realization that frightened them most: if they waited much longer, you might stop caring altogether. And for the first time, they weren't afraid of losing an argument or looking vulnerable. They were afraid of losing you. That fear finally pushed them toward a decision. Your soulmate stopped typing the safe message and started writing the honest one. They wanted to tell you that the secret meeting wasn't about replacing you, judging you, or discussing you behind your back in the way you might have feared. It was about trying to understand what they could no longer understand from a distance. They wanted answers because their feelings had become impossible to ignore. But there was still one complication. The person close to you had mentioned something during the conversation that your soulmate hadn't fully understood at first, a change in your life that could mean you were preparing to move forward without them. Now that possibility was becoming real. Your soulmate looked at the unfinished message, took a breath, and finally pressed send. But the message they sent wasn't what they had originally planned to say, and the reason why could reveal exactly what they were hoping you would do next. The message arrived more honestly than your soulmate had intended. Instead of pretending everything was normal, they finally admitted that something had been bothering them for a long time. They said they had recently spoken with someone close to you, and that conversation forced them to confront feelings they had been avoiding. They didn't explain every detail, but they made one thing clear: they had realized they couldn't keep pretending the distance between you didn't matter. They told you they had been afraid of approaching you because they didn't know whether you would welcome them or shut the door completely. Then came the sentence that carried the most weight: they said they didn't want to hear about you through other people anymore. They wanted to hear your truth directly. For the first time, your soulmate wasn't hiding behind someone else's perspective. They were asking you to give them a chance to understand what had really happened between you. But there was another reason behind that message, one they hadn't admitted yet. Your soulmate was also thinking about what the person close to you had said about your future. They had heard enough to realize that you might be entering a completely different chapter of your life. Maybe you were becoming more independent. Maybe you were emotionally detaching. Maybe you had simply decided that waiting for someone who couldn't make up their mind was no longer fair to yourself. Whatever the change was, your soulmate could feel the urgency. They didn't want to arrive after the door had already closed. And that realization brought back memories of every time they almost reached out before but stopped themselves. Every maybe later suddenly looked different. Every opportunity they postponed seemed to be disappearing. Stay till the end, because this is where the secret conversation finally connects to something you may have noticed recently. There may have been a reason certain things suddenly felt different around you, and your soulmate may have been watching those changes from much closer than you realized. Then your soulmate received the response they had been waiting for, but it wasn't what they expected. Your words didn't give them an immediate yes or no. Instead, you made them understand that if they truly wanted to know how you felt, they would have to stop searching for answers through other people and have an honest conversation with you. That response changed everything. Your soulmate realized that you weren't demanding perfection. You were demanding clarity. And suddenly, the secret meeting no longer felt like the beginning of a problem. It felt like the moment that finally pushed both of you toward the truth. But then your soulmate asked one last question, this time, not to the person close to you, but to themselves. If I finally tell them everything, am I ready for whatever answer comes back? They stared at your message for several moments before making their choice. And what they decided to reveal next was something they had kept hidden from everyone, including the person they had secretly met. Your soulmate finally understood that the secret meeting had only uncovered the surface of what was really happening. There was a deeper truth they had been carrying, something they had never fully explained to anyone because saying it aloud would make everything real. They admitted to themselves that their distance from you had never been about a lack of feelings. In fact, it was the opposite. The connection had become so important that they were afraid of making one wrong move and losing it forever. That fear made them hesitate, and hesitation slowly turned into silence. They remembered the private conversation with the person close to you and realized why it had affected them so deeply. Hearing that you might actually move forward forced them to stop imagining endless possibilities and face the present moment. They could no longer assume you would always be there when they finally found the courage to act. And that realization created a sense of urgency they had never felt before. Then came the revelation they had been keeping hidden. Your soulmate had been planning to speak to you much earlier. They had even imagined how the conversation would happen, what they would say, and how they would explain everything they had been unable to express. But each time the opportunity appeared, something stopped them. They worried you would ask questions they weren't ready to answer. They worried you would remember every moment they disappointed you. Most of all, they feared hearing that you had finally stopped waiting. The person close to you had unknowingly confirmed that fear, but they had also given your soulmate something they desperately needed: perspective. Your soulmate now understood that if they wanted another chance, they couldn't approach you with half-truths. They had to come with the whole story. So they made a decision to stop protecting their image and start protecting the connection. And for the first time, they prepared to tell you exactly why they had been holding back. But before they could have that conversation, something happened that made everything even more intense. Your soulmate noticed a small change in the way you were communicating with them. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation. Yet something about your tone made them realize you were no longer waiting for them to figure everything out. You had become calmer, stronger, less interested in chasing explanations. And that frightened them more than anger ever could. Because anger can mean someone still wants answers. Silence can mean they've already made peace with leaving. Your soulmate suddenly understood that the person close to you hadn't simply given them information, they had given them a final warning. If they wanted to be part of your future, they needed to stop standing outside the door and hoping you would open it for them. They needed to knock. And this time, they were ready. But the first thing they planned to say when they finally faced you could completely change how you understand that secret meeting. When your soulmate finally faced the truth, the entire meaning of that secret meeting became clear. They hadn't met someone close to you because they wanted to create confusion. They went because they were trying to understand something they were too afraid to ask you directly, whether there was still a place for them in your heart. They had been carrying doubt, regret, and unfinished feelings, and hearing someone who knew you describe your perspective forced them to see the situation differently.